Welcome back to Deadscape Diaries, where we explore the darkest corners of the unknown. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Today, we're delving into an unsettling tale that combines ancient folklore with a modern nightmare. This is the story of the Skinwalker's campground. It was a warm summer evening when four friends decided to embark on a weekend camping trip. The group, Jake, Lily, Marcus, and Elena, had been best friends since high school, and their adventures into the wilderness were a cherished tradition. This time, however, their destination was a bit different. Jake had found a remote campground deep in the heart of Navajo territory. "I've read about this place," Jake said, his enthusiasm lighting up the group chat weeks earlier. "It's supposed to be untouched by tourists. No crowds, just pure nature." Lily, always the skeptic, had raised an eyebrow when she heard the plan. "Isn't that area, like, sacred or something? I've read about some creepy stuff tied to Navajo lands." "You've been watching too many ghost hunter shows," Marcus teased, but there was an edge of nervousness in his laugh. Despite Lily's reservations, the group packed their gear and drove out early Saturday morning. The journey took them farther from civilization than they had anticipated. Cell service dropped hours before they arrived, and the winding dirt roads seemed to stretch endlessly into the dense forest. By the time they reached the campground, the sun was dipping low in the sky, painting the trees in hues of gold and crimson. The site itself was beautiful. Towering pines surrounded a large clearing, and a crystal-clear creek wound its way nearby, its gentle babble the only sound aside from the occasional chirp of a bird. But as they began setting up their tents, Lily couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She glanced over her shoulder more than once, her eyes scanning the tree line, but there was nothing there. "You okay?" Elena asked, noticing Lily's unease. "Yeah," Lily replied, forcing a smile. "Just adjusting to the quiet, I guess." As night fell, the friends gathered around a roaring campfire. They laughed, told stories, and roasted marshmallows, the warmth of the fire pushing back the encroaching darkness. Jake, ever the storyteller, decided to regale the group with a local legend he'd come across while researching the area. "Have you guys ever heard of a skinwalker?" he asked, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Lily immediately stiffened. "Seriously, Jake? Of all the stories, you're picking that one?" "Come on," Jake said, grinning. "It's just a story. Supposedly, a skinwalker is a witch, a shapeshifter that can take the form of animals or even other people. They're said to haunt these kinds of places, preying on fear. And you thought this was a good idea to bring us here?" Lily shot back, her voice laced with irritation. "Relax," Marcus interjected, throwing an arm around Lily. "It's just a myth. Besides, there's four of us. What's the worst that could happen?" The group laughed nervously and eventually turned in for the night, but Lily found it hard to sleep. Every rustle of leaves outside her tent seemed louder than it should have been, and she swore she heard faint whispers carried on the breeze. When she finally drifted off, her dreams were uneasy and fragmented, visions of glowing eyes and shadowy figures lurking just beyond the firelight. The next morning, the group awoke to find their campsite eerily quiet. The usual chorus of birds and insects was absent, replaced by an oppressive silence that made the air feel heavier. Jake shrugged it off as an effect of their remote location, but Lily's unease deepened. While the others went to explore the creek, Lily stayed behind to organize their supplies. She was halfway through repacking their cooler when she noticed something odd. A single, deep scratch ran along the side of the cooler's lid, as though something with claws had tried to pry it open. "Hey, did one of you do this?" she called out when the group returned. The others exchanged confused looks before Jake stepped closer to examine the scratch. That wasn't there last night. Maybe it was an animal, Elena suggested, though her voice lacked conviction. What kind of animal leaves a mark like that? Lily countered, holding up the cooler for emphasis. Before anyone could respond, a low, guttural growl sounded from the woods. It was unlike anything they had ever heard, a mix of human and animal, distorted and menacing. The group froze, their eyes darting toward the treeline. "That's probably just a coyote," Marcus said, though his voice wavered. "Coyotes don't sound like that," Lily whispered, her face pale. The growl came again, closer this time, and the friends huddled together instinctively. Jake reached for the hatchet he'd brought, gripping it tightly as he scanned the shadows. For a moment, all was still. Then, a branch snapped, and a figure darted between the trees, too fast for any of them to get a clear look. "We need to leave," Lily said, her voice urgent. "Now." "It's probably just an animal," Jake insisted, though his knuckles were white around the hatchet handle. "Let's not panic." But panic was exactly what set in when they returned to their tents later that afternoon. The fabric of Lily's tent had been slashed open, the sleeping bag inside torn to shreds. Worse still, large, unnatural footprints surrounded the campsite, the shape of them human-like but elongated, with clawed toes. "Okay, I'm done," Lily said, her voice shaking. "We're leaving." Jake hesitated but nodded. "Fine. Let's pack up and get out of here." As the group hurriedly gathered their belongings, the oppressive silence returned, broken only by the sound of their frantic movements. And then, just as they were about to leave, a blood-curdling scream echoed through the forest, a scream that sounded eerily like Elena. But Elena was standing right beside them. The air in the campground grew heavier as the sun vanished completely, leaving the forest wrapped in a shroud of darkness. The faint light from the campfire flickered uncertainly, casting jagged shadows on the tents and surrounding trees. The group huddled close, trying to shake off the growing unease. "Did anyone else hear that?" Lindsay whispered, her voice trembling. Trevor nodded. "Yeah. It was like a scream, but not human. More like a—" "Don't say it," Chris interrupted, his face pale. "We're just psyching ourselves out." "Or we're not," Maddie countered, her eyes scanning the dark woods. "We're in Navajo territory, and you've all heard the stories about skinwalkers, right?" Chris groaned. "Come on, Maddie. Not this again." "I'm serious," she said, lowering her voice. "They're shapeshifters. Malevolent spirits that can mimic voices and appearances. The elders say you should never call them by name because it attracts them." A gust of wind blew through the trees, making the flames of the campfire sputter. The sudden chill sent shivers through the group. "Maddie, you're not helping," Chris muttered. "She's not wrong," Trevor said. "I mean, legends like that come from somewhere. And if what we heard earlier wasn't human, He trailed off, his expression grim. Lindsay's eyes widened. Wait, you're seriously saying we're dealing with a... Stop saying it, Maddie hissed. The forest fell silent. Not the kind of silence filled with the gentle rustling of leaves or the chirping of crickets. This was an oppressive, unnatural stillness. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Chris stood abruptly. I'm going to check the perimeter. Make sure there's nothing out there. Trevor grabbed his arm. Don't go alone. Someone's gotta do it. We can't all just sit here freaking out, Chris said, forcing a shaky grin. Besides, it's probably just a coyote or something. Before anyone could stop him, Chris picked up a flashlight and walked into the woods, the beam of light bobbing with his movements until it disappeared behind the dense trees. Minutes passed. Then 20. The group sat in tense silence, their eyes darting between the fire and the path Chris had taken. He should be back by now, Lindsay whispered. He probably got lost, Maddie said, though her voice lacked conviction. Trevor stood, grabbing his own flashlight. I'll go find him. Not alone, Maddie insisted. We go together. The three of them moved cautiously into the forest, the light from their flashlights cutting through the suffocating darkness. Every creak of a branch and crunch of leaves underfoot made their hearts race. Chris? Trevor called out, his voice echoing eerily. No response. Chris, this isn't funny. Lindsay shouted, her voice cracking. They came to a clearing where Chris's flashlight lay on the ground, its beam pointing skyward. Oh, no, Maddie whispered, picking it up. Where is he? Trevor's flashlight flickered, then went out. He smacked it against his palm, but it refused to come back on. A low growl emerged from the shadows, freezing them in place. What was that? Lindsay whispered. Run, Maddie said, her voice barely audible. What? Run! Maddie screamed. They bolted back toward the campsite, the growling growing louder and closer with every step. Lindsay stumbled, and Trevor turned back to help her up. As they reached the campfire, they stopped, gasping for breath. The growling had stopped, but the oppressive silence had returned. Where's Maddie? Lindsay asked, her voice trembling. Trevor spun around. Maddie was nowhere to be seen. The two of them stayed close to the fire, clutching whatever they could find as makeshift weapons. Hours passed with no sign of Maddie or Chris. Exhaustion began to set in, but neither dared to sleep. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Chris. He stumbled toward the fire, his face pale and his movements jerky. Chris! Lindsay cried, running toward him. But Trevor grabbed her arm, stopping her. Wait, he said, his voice low. Something's not right. Chris's head tilted unnaturally, and his lips curled into a chilling grin. You should have stayed away, he said, his voice distorted and inhuman. Trevor and Lindsay backed away as the figure lunged toward them, its movements unnervingly fast and animalistic. Trevor grabbed a burning branch from the fire and swung it at the creature, which let out an ear-piercing shriek before retreating into the woods. That wasn't Chris, Lindsay whispered, tears streaming down her face. Trevor nodded grimly. We're not alone out here. Trevor and Lindsay sat close to the dwindling campfire, its feeble light their only protection against the suffocating darkness. The forest around them was unnervingly quiet, but the tension in the air was deafening. Each crackle of the fire made them flinch, their eyes darting toward the surrounding trees. "What do we do now?" Lindsay whispered, clutching the knife she'd grabbed from her backpack. Her knuckles were white, her voice trembling with fear. Trevor's jaw tightened as he scanned the perimeter. "We survive. Whatever that thing is, it's playing with us. It's waiting for us to make a mistake." "But what about Maddie?" Lindsay's voice broke as tears welled in her eyes. "We can't just leave her out there." Trevor's heart sank. He wanted to believe Maddie was still alive, but the distorted thing they'd seen in Chris's form left little hope. He didn't have the heart to say it aloud, though. "If we're going to find her, we need a plan. First, we make sure this fire stays lit." Lindsay nodded, sniffling, and began gathering whatever dry wood she could find nearby. Trevor kept his eyes trained on the shadows, gripping a makeshift torch he'd fashioned from a branch and cloth soaked in lighter fluid. The oppressive silence was broken by a faint, guttural growl that seemed to echo from all directions. Lindsay froze, her hands full of twigs. "It's close," Trevor muttered. "Stay by the fire." As they backed toward the warmth of the flames, the growling ceased. For a moment, there was nothing but the crackling fire. Then, a voice rang out from the darkness. "Trevor? Lindsay?" It was Maddie's voice. Lindsay's head snapped up, her face lighting with hope. "Maddie," she called out, taking a step forward. Trevor grabbed her arm. "Wait. It could be it." The voice came again, closer this time. "Guys, help me. Please, it's me." Trevor's grip tightened. If it's really Maddie, she'll come into the light. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Then, a figure stumbled into view, illuminated by the firelight. It was Maddie. Her face was pale, her clothes torn, but she looked unharmed. Lindsay broke free from Trevor's grasp and ran to her. "Maddie, you're okay." Trevor stayed back, his eyes narrowing as he watched Maddie's movements. Something felt off. Her steps were deliberate but too smooth, too calculated. "Lindsay, wait," he shouted, but it was too late. Maddie's head snapped toward Trevor with an unnatural speed, her eyes glinting with a predatory gleam. A low, guttural growl escaped her throat, and before Lindsay could react, Maddie's form twisted and contorted. Her limbs lengthened grotesquely, her face elongating into a wolf-like snout. The creature let out an ear-piercing screech that sent Lindsay stumbling backward in terror. "Run!" Trevor yelled, grabbing Lindsay's arm and pulling her away from the creature. They bolted into the forest, their flashlights barely cutting through the darkness. The sound of snapping branches and guttural growls pursued them, growing louder with each passing second. Trevor's mind raced as he tried to remember the details of the legends Maddie had mentioned. What had the elders said about defeating these things? Salt, he muttered to himself. Or fire. Fireworks. What? Lindsay panted, barely keeping up. "We need to fight it with fire," Trevor said, his grip tightening on the makeshift torch. They burst into another clearing, this one dominated by a massive, gnarled tree that seemed older than the forest itself. Trevor stopped abruptly and turned to face the direction they'd come from. "What are you doing?" Lindsay cried. "We have to keep moving." "No," Trevor said firmly. "If we keep running, it'll pick us off one by one. We make our stand here." Lindsay's eyes darted around the clearing, her panic mounting. "Trevor, we're going to die." "Not if we stick together," he said, igniting the torch. "Get behind me." The creature emerged from the trees, its grotesque form illuminated by the torchlight. It towered over them, its eyes glowing an unnatural yellow and its claws glinting in the dim light. Trevor's grip on the torch tightened as the creature let out a guttural growl, its mouth curling into a sinister grin. "You shouldn't have come here," it snarled, its voice a chilling blend of human and animal tones. "Stay back," Trevor shouted, thrusting the torch toward it. The creature recoiled slightly, but its grin only widened. "Fire won't save you." Trevor glanced at Lindsay, who was clutching the knife. "Lindsay, do you have any salt? Anything?" She fumbled through her backpack, her hands shaking. I think there's some in the camping supplies." "Get it. Now." As Lindsay rummaged through her bag, the creature lunged at Trevor. He swung the torch, narrowly missing its face, but the flames were enough to make it hesitate. "Hurry, Lindsay," he shouted, his voice strained. "Got it," she cried, pulling out a small packet of salt. "Throw it," Trevor yelled. Lindsay tore open the packet and flung the salt at the creature. It let out a blood-curdling screech as the salt hit its skin, causing smoke to rise where it made contact. The creature thrashed wildly, its form flickering as if struggling to maintain its shape. "Keep going," Trevor urged. Lindsay grabbed another packet and threw it with trembling hands. The creature let out one final, ear-splitting howl before collapsing to the ground. Its body disintegrated into a pile of ash, which was quickly carried away by an unnatural gust of wind. The forest fell silent once more, but this time it was a natural quiet, the rustling of leaves, the distant call of an owl. Lindsay dropped to her knees, sobbing with relief. "It's over," she whispered. Trevor sank to the ground beside her, his hands trembling. "For now." They returned to the campsite at dawn, the first rays of sunlight breaking through the trees. There was no sign of Maddie or Chris, only their abandoned belongings. The fire had burned out, leaving behind a cold, empty pit. As they packed up to leave, Trevor couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Just as they reached the edge of the forest, he turned back one last time. For a fleeting moment, he thought he saw a pair of glowing yellow eyes in the shadows, but when he blinked, they were gone. Thanks for watching Deadscape Diaries. If this story sent shivers down your spine, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Stay tuned for more tales that will keep